Kaiser, you're doing the introduction, right? Like, or am I supposed to do that? Can't. That was the one thing I should have asked before we went live.
Nope, I got it.
Okay,
So I'll start here in a little bit.
no worries.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the UNM Law and Mental Health series. Weekly discussions of practice and science featuring experts in behavioral health and the law. This series is run by the University of New Mexico's Division of Forensic Behavioral Sciences and our Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, in support with the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. I'm Kaisa Marshall, an assistant professor here at UNM, and I am filling in for Anthony Perillo today. For our talk today, please ask any questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box, anytime that you feel comfortable, but just know that we will not get to them until the end. We always try to do our best to get to as many of your questions as possible, but please forgive us if we can't get to yours. If you are pursuing continuing medical education, the sign-in sheet will be in the chat box shortly. There will also be a link posted for APA continuing education credits in the chat box, but that will happen towards the end of the presentation. You will have to save your certificate after you complete the survey because we don't keep copies. If you missed last week's talk in the series, Lisa Kahn, Chrislyn Tussey, and Beth Arredondo's discussion on issues of aging and cognition relevant to forensic evaluation is now available on our YouTube channel. The recordings for this week's talks should also be available on our YouTube page later this week, and the PowerPoint slides will be accessible for those registered for the series later in this week as well. As a heads up, next week we will have David Feldman discussing forensic evaluation with deaf individuals. But let's get back to this week. I'd like to introduce you to today's speaker, who will be discussing artificial intelligence use in forensic research, Dr. Natalie Armstrong. Dr. Armstrong received her doctoral degree in clinical psychology from Sam Houston State University. She completed internship at Eastern Virginia Medical School and a postdoctoral fellowship in forensic psychology at the Medical University of South Carolina. She obtained board certification in forensic psychology in 2024. Dr. Armstrong is licensed in Virginia and Massachusetts and is also certified through SciPact. Her professional career centers on public sector forensic evaluation work and developing research infrastructure for large organizations. Her private sector work focuses on civil forensic evaluation work with families and juvenile forensic evaluations. She is currently a forensic psychologist and chair of the Institutional Review Board of the Virginia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services. Her research interests include quality of forensic report writing, disseminating information about forensic assessments in strict security settings, and the impact of ethics and artificial intelligence on forensic psychology. So, Tally, on behalf of UNM, we are excited to have you join our series and thankful for you sharing your expertise with us today. I'm now going to turn it over to you.
Why, thank you. So this is part of the ongoing lecture series that me and my colleagues agreed to do for LMH regarding AI usage in forensic mental health. So I get to take the research component today. It's a packed schedule, so I will do my best to not speak too fast, but in any event, we're going to be really focusing on the intersectionality of AI with research. And I want to be clear that when I talk about AI today, it's really about generative AI, not like AI spell check or AI is like, personality assessment analysis or outputs. Like, that's not real AI. This is the generative stuff that my colleagues and I have been describing in our past discussions for LMH. So just keep that in mind. Obviously, these are the disclosures that I have to put up for everybody. And also, I don't receive any kind of financial support from any platforms, and I don't advocate for the use of any particular platform today. Obviously, these are our learning objectives, which I think also went out in the email. But hopefully by the end of today's talk, you will feel a little more comfortable in these particular areas. And I also want to be clear that cultural considerations are particularly important when we think about artificial intelligence, including in research, because it is tempting for us to believe that AI somehow will in a research sphere kind of absolve us of bias. AI can help us identify patterns of bias in a data set we're analyzing. We still have to remember that the AI research programs were themselves created by humans and therefore will have some element of bias. And also they were trained on data that very likely contain culturally relevant biases. And it is through that lens that it will continue to operate. That doesn't negate the value of incorporating AI into research, but it is really important for us to consider when we're thinking about contextualizing the generalizability of the results from those platforms and identifying the limitations of that research, especially if you're using it as like a research partner. And it's also important for us as reviewers and editors to recognize that AI platforms will always have some element of bias, and that should be acknowledged when the manuscript is submitted for publication. Okay, so this is, again, our very robust agenda, but just know that if you aren't able to kind of follow along as easily as you might like to, this is how the slides are structured, so that way you can kind of go at your own pace when the slides come to you separately, or if you choose to watch the recording later on. So some of you may already be aware of how artificial intelligence, or I'll also use the phrase machine learning interchangeably during our time together today, and how that's been started and used in social science research. AI in social science research is not new in the sense that it started pre-pandemic, but it has really proliferated in the post-pandemic era, largely due to advances in AI-based tech. This is really exciting because when it's used correctly, it can really help us analyze very large data sets, complex data sets. It's really going to help qualitative research studies, and it can help identify new patterns or insights that we might otherwise have missed. So here's an example of what I mean when we think about how emerging social science research can benefit from artificial intelligence. If you're wondering what unsupervised machine learning is, don't panic. I promise to get to that later. But here, they were able to kind of identify non-credible symptom reporting from multiple symptom validity tests when it comes to assessing ADHD, which is pretty exciting. So again, not all AI research is created equal. And so what we're seeing too is that AI can be a helpful actor, but it can also be a bad actor when it comes to research. There are definitely instances of AI being used unhelpfully or inappropriately. So AI can be used to access publicly available data sets and then generate publications at high rates with low quality. Those are also known sometimes as paper mills, where it's just a group of people or a company that will kind of scour publicly available data sets and just pump out papers one after the other. So not only can it be used in that capacity, but AI can also be used to forge data sets. And so AI forged data sets and falsified peer reviews have started to contribute to the publication of fabricated research, and that has caused a lot of papers to be retracted over the years. Some of you might be wondering, how could you forge a data set? There is a particular methodology called the generative adversarial network. This is one of those things where I'm not telling you because I want you to use it, but it is important for you to be aware of it. This is just one example of how data sets can be forged with AI. It uses two machine learning frameworks, and the subtype is that they're neural networks. One serves as a generator where it generates actual data, and then the other neural network is the discriminator, and the prompts are that they compete against each other to create increasingly realistic looking data. And then people will use that data to create falsified publications. So not only is the data falsified, but the publications are also falsified because they're being used off of falsified data. So as of 2024, this is something that has been happening with increasing frequency. The United States, so like this is an example of like what's coming up right now, kind of like public sector stuff. So AI use has increased exponentially. Really with the public launch of ChatGPT in 2022, that has made it extremely, I don't know, it's really lowered the bar to entry for people to try to publish stuff that maybe is not very helpful. It's lower in the US than in other countries. Right now, China, the Middle East, and India are experiencing a lot of issues with paper mills and falsified research. But the US-based institutions are not immune. And that's because we have had instances where publications in the US have like put out AI flagged research or paper mill research or whatever you want to call it. It's not clear how often that is actually happening, where that data are being fabricated or paper mills are occurring in the US specifically. Right now, it seems to be that US journals are getting duped into pushing research out that isn't actually legitimate. The most famous example is that Wiley retracted over 10,000 papers within the last 5 years after it acquired a particular publication group. So there are lots of things that we can do to talk about how to resolve that. But there have also been emerging concerns about AI accessing more than just big data, and that it can kind of infiltrate us at a kind of more micro level. So here are some graphics from a BMJ article that were published in 2026. As you can see, the United States is kind of low on the totem pole for having publications flagged as AI generated or somehow kind of overly kind of messed with by AI. But if you look over here, you can see that several of the publishers are kind of higher up on the totem pole. And those are publishers that we work with in the forensic community. So hopefully for those of you in the audience who are editors or associate editors for some of our, really kind of meaningful journals, you guys have already been having these ongoing conversations with those publishers about how to kind of navigate this issue. But this is important for us as reviewers and consumers to know that we may need to start taking a kind of more thoughtful eye to some of the research that's coming out in the coming years. And so again, at this point, you might be wondering, well, this is troubling, but like, how does this actually translate over into like clinical and forensic psychology or even clinical and forensic psychiatry, right? The courts haven't even quite figured out how they want us to deal with AI. So like, is this really something that we should be concerned about at the research phase? So if you weren't convinced by my initial pitch, there was a podcast that was published in 2023 through the Association of Psychological Science, where researchers came together to talk about how to fight paper mills and to kind of ask the question of, is this actually showing up in psychology? And what they found was a cluster of articles were showing up in the Journal of Community Psychology and in at least one or two other journals that were psychologically based that looked like paper mill research. And so the researchers that were talking on this podcast decided to do the equivalent of a sting operation and submit a manuscript to that journal, JCP, asking about whether or not they should be concerned about paper mills coming out in psychological research. And so it wasn't clear to them if the editor had just like fallen asleep at the wheel and wasn't aware that they were promulgating paper mill or AI generated research, or if they were actually getting kickbacks from those companies, which is something that happens. And so what they did is after they submitted that manuscript, it got desk rejected. And so that signaled to them that maybe something a little more nefarious was going on. And they asked like the integrity officer or the ethics officer for the journal to investigate what had happened. And it turned out that there was an issue and the papers that they suspected of being AI generated ultimately were retracted. So it is something that's happening in our field. The other thing that we don't want to forget is that people are using AI to provide falsified responses on social science surveys, or they're feeding protected test material into AI to cheat cognitive testing. A really good example is a YouTube video from this consulting firm in Australia where the psychologist on staff fed ChatGPT 3.5 in version 4 cognitive test questions to see what kind of answers it would generate. I have some feelings about that because it's like proprietary test material, but if a psychologist is doing that, then no doubt lay people could do that if they were incentivized to do so. But again, it's still an open question of how frequently is this happening? And so it would be helpful if we actually were able to generate some research to kind of figure that out. Okay, so if we are kind of stepping away from the meta message and talking about, okay, I am in forensics or I'm clinical forensic, and I want to think about incorporating AI into my research plan. Can I do that? The short answer is yes. You just want to be thoughtful about it. And there is some definition related stuff that I want to go over with you first before we get into some examples of how people have been doing that and ways that you can do it thoughtfully. So one thing I want to define for us is like, what's an open system versus a closed system? And I know that we, as like a team, when we've done LMH talks, have kind of alluded to this before, but I want to be really clear here that an open system is what a lot of us have the most exposure to. That's like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, Grok, right? These are free, although they have paid subscriptions, but they are fundamentally free, at least right now. And they have a very wide reach. Most of the time across information available on the internet compared to what we call closed system models. Okay, closed system models are platforms that are trained theoretically outside of connection to the internet when they are designed to be used for research. Okay, so closed system models usually are designed for research use. So like their statistical partners, things like that. But the original source code for the closed system may have been developed in an open model format. So like BERT, which is a platform I'll be talking about later, is one of those where it was developed in an open system, but then was translated into a closed system for research purposes. And so it's important that we know that that is what closed system is designed for, because a lot of the closed system models also use what we call natural language processing or machine learning. And so this is just the specific way that the model operates. So NLP or machine learning are really designed for that kind of qualitative element where you feed it a lot of text data. You can feed it numbers, but it is really kind of designed to analyze like large chunks of text-based data, which is really cool. Another benefit of kind of closed system or machine learning models is that they are better at encoding and recognizing linguistic patterns because they are kind of that encoding based. Okay. And so they are not going to be able to generate text the way that open system models are. And so that changes a little bit what you can do in terms of asking the research question and gathering data using AI. So if you're wanting to analyze the text that's generated from a particular AI platform, open system models are going to be a better bet for you. The other kind of dyad that I want to talk about is supervised versus unsupervised modeling. So supervised and unsupervised modeling is going to occur in closed system models, or at the very least, you're going to have the most control over modeling when you're using a closed system. Supervised is when you provide the model or instruct it to follow a set of parameters. So, you know, when we do statistical analysis and SPSS data or Python, we can set all kinds of parameters. We can account for variables. We can weight variables in certain ways. Okay, that's what you would be doing in like a supervised modeling session. If you are trying to do supervised modeling with an open system model, you're going to have a much harder time executing that effectively because you will never be able to get the open model to spit out a syntax or a code that tells you exactly whether it followed what you wanted it to do or how it followed it if it deviated. With closed system models, you have a lot more control over that. The other thing that you can do with closed system models is that you can allow it to do basically like exploratory modeling or unsupervised modeling. And that's kind of the most exciting part of incorporating AI into clinical or forensic research, because that's where you let the model kind of identify new insights or be able to kind of create new pathways for connections between variables that maybe we would not have otherwise been able to identify. Okay. So another way that we want to think about AI in research, now that we have kind of the basic terminology of this, the models or platforms in play, is can we use AI in like two different ways? Now, I am going to assume for the audience that when I talk about research, and I talk about it in this way from here on out, that we have crossed the barrier of informed consent, recordings of transcripts, uploading it into platforms, et cetera, et cetera. Those are basic elements of research methodology that I don't think I need to revisit, and that I am assuming that we would have all surmounted before we use any one of these platforms for research purposes. And so one way to think about it is AI as the independent variable and AI as the statistician, right? Am I studying the AI platform itself? So am I studying the information it gives me? Or am I using the platform to help me answer a particular question? Am I treating it as like a statistician or like a research partner or part of the data analysis plan? Okay, and so it's this latter piece here, right? AI as a statistician, where we have seen it start to emerge already in psychological research, particularly in the clinical area. So I think I had already showed you the example, of ADHD and malingering. That's a really good example of looking at AI as an independent variable. Okay. And then there are lots of other ways that we've seen AI being used as the statistician. That has shown up largely in like threat assessment and risk assessment research, but it's going to start to show up in other places as well. Okay, so to talk a little bit more about AI as the independent variable, right? A lot of us think that like open system platforms can be great for independent variable research because they, again, have that really vast reach and they can sometimes get data that would otherwise be difficult to access. That's a double-edged sword for a lot of reasons that I think my colleagues have talked about in other ways. But when we think about AI as the independent variable, you would specifically be asking the platform to respond to specific user inputs or its ability to kind of give you output that is in a particular area of inquiry. Okay, this is not the same as asking the platform to help you analyze the output that it gives you or the output that you get from asking the same prompt to other platforms. So like asking GPT or Claude to analyze outputs that you got from Grok or Gemini. Okay, open systems can provide you some statistical analysis because they have the ability to access like free statistical analysis programs or basically anything on the internet that could instruct it to create a formula for analysis. But at that point, you'll have then kind of crossed the Rubicon into having it be both the independent variable and the statistician, and that can create a lot of methodological confounds. In addition, it's not going to like it will give you something as an output, but it will be really difficult for you to know if the output is accurate because, again, it's not going to be able to probably tell you all of the formulas it used, how it weighted the variables, even if you gave it instructions to do so. Like there's just a lot of unknowns and barriers to that that for me are very easily solved by just reverting over to a closed system for analysis. And there are closed systems available that are free, like you don't have to pay for it. So why would you go through the headache of having to kind of use an open platform and have to have all these caveats and justifications or addressing limitations when you can just easily go over to a closed system and use it that way? So again, open systems are great. Sometimes people think they're all powerful, but in fact, they have some notable limitations. So what would be a good way to maybe use an open platform as an independent variable? And it makes sense for us to ask this question because public or open system platforms communicate information to users, and these platforms are being accessed by millions of users, millions of times per day. And so one thing that we've started to see emerging is looking at the platforms to examine the questions that might be asked by an individual preparing for an assessment. Like you can use these to ask questions like, how would you define malingering? And is that definition sufficient to give someone an idea of how to do it successfully for an outpatient forensic evaluation? And so again, the response output could be limited for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that it depends on the way that the prompt is constructed. It depends on what version you're using, and it depends on some other factors that I'll get to here in just a second. And again, I'm not even touching the issues of, putting a prompt in that doesn't violate like informed consent stuff or something like that. There have also been instances where researchers have created vignettes and put the vignette into an open facing platform like GPT or Gemini to see if it's able to kind of decode kind of meaningful data within that vignette that would be used for a forensically relevant purpose. So here would be an example of what I mean. And so they used ChatGPT as an independent variable where they asked it to identify information about the insanity defense and psychosis, and then to kind of use both of those definitions to assist the user in simulating a psychotic illness to avoid legal consequences. And so they used this, what came out in it says 2025. So that's what it should show up as. And they use ChatGPT 3.5. But right now we're on, I think, ChatGPT version at least 5. So it just goes to show you how quickly this research, while really helpful, can easily become outdated because the versions of the open-facing platforms are changing at such an exponentially quick rate. And so right now, open platforms are changing so rapidly, and not just because they're updating versions, but there's kind of the infinite expansion of the internet, and the platforms kind of continuously absorbing user queries to train the models iteratively. This question of AI as an independent variable for how accurate can AI give us psychoeducation about forensic mental health stuff is really useful for us as providers, but it's still going to become outdated relatively quickly. But there is a lot of potential for these platforms to advance to the point where there are some ideas that I've generated that could be theoretically useful in the future. And so, some ways that this might happen is that we could see these open-facing platforms, see if reports conform to best standard guidelines. Can they detect malingering from uploaded transcripts and interviews without the use of test data? Can they detect bias in written work products of court transcripts or testimony? Again, assuming that all of the issues with like privacy protections and informed consent would have been resolved. All right. So again, coming back to kind of looking at AI as the independent variable, what were some things that they did well? So this is now what I want you all to, when you kind of look at this slide or hear me talking, I would like you to think about this from the sense of, if I were going to use this article for either my forensic practice, or if I were evaluating it for publication in a journal, what are some things that I would want to see in the methodology and results section? So one of the things that it did well is that it identified which version of GPT that it used. Again, that should be kind of self-evident at this point because the open-facing platforms are kind of moving at a really quick rate. They also identified general parameters for the prompt. So like, what was the general theoretical basis for the questions or the prompts that they put into ChatGPT? They also used the same prompt several times. So they would prompt ChatGPT on multiple occasions to see if it provided a different range of answers. And it did. They also used what we call a new conversation window to reduce bias, which means that they basically started a new thread to make sure that the previous conversations that they had had with ChatGPT were carrying over less into this particular research methodology. They also did not ask GPT to code the output data. They had that done by human beings. And they acknowledged limitations of the open system platform, which is really important. There were some things that they could have done to improve the quality of the manuscript when we think about it from kind of manipulating GPT. And one is that they really hit the nail on the head in terms of why they were asking this question in the first place. It's really about giving us as forensic clinicians more insight into what is ChatGPT actually giving people when they ask it these kinds of questions. Again, we don't really know how often people are soliciting ChatGPT or any of the open-facing platforms to try to malinger per se, but it would be helpful for us as clinicians or practitioners to know the kind of output that we could get if we asked it those questions, because that can inform the way that maybe we need to start tailoring our interviews, for example. Some other things that I would have liked to have seen was that the way that the prompts themselves were developed was not particularly clear. And there's research that shows that AI, especially ChatGPT, responds differentially when different dialects of English language are used, right? So ChatGPT and a lot of the other open-facing platforms are built off of like white English speaking language as opposed to other specific dialects within kind of English. And so that could have had an impact. It's also not clear if they modulated the reading level of the prompts to align with what we know about kind of the average US population's reading level, because that has shown to differentially impact the output that AI gives you. It's also not clear if they used a brand new profile for platform engagement. Like I had mentioned above, they used a new chat window, but that still allows for leakage from previous conversations over into the new chat. So ideally, you would be generating a brand new profile to engage with GPT for research purposes to avoid that leakage. And then they also didn't compare across platforms. In the grand scheme of things, that's not like the biggest sin, but it would have been really interesting to see, especially if they predicated the pilot study from an info gathering standpoint. Okay, so again, if we're going to be citing this research, right, if I'm a researcher and I've done a research study like this and I want to send it in for publication, I would want to make sure that I'm using good qualitative analysis programs, and that I would also want to make sure that I have screenshots or exportable PDFs of the input and output that I got from the open-facing platforms. And so these directives, I'm just going to say, will work for platforms that are not OpenAI or Claude focused, but we're just going to stay on this for now. So if you have like a free version that you're using for the research, you want to make sure that you have background graphics enabled, or that you have an extension added so that you can have an easy conversion. It's less helpful when it is exported into a Word document, just because it increases the risk of text getting garbled. It makes readability an issue because it's harder to tell who's the input and who's the output. And of course, you don't want to give the impression that maybe things had been like deleted or changed because it's in a Word document as opposed to a PDF that was a direct export. You also want to make sure that you're aware of the version, again, to kind of identify limitations. If you're using an older version of GPT, Claude, or Gemini, you want to see if you can compare answers over time, because again, the version, even within the same version, will change its responses. And then create a profile just for research comparisons, as I had mentioned earlier. Why would this be important, do you ask? Why do I need to know? So if you look in the top right-hand corner of both of these graphics, I asked Claude and GPT the same prompt. And so what you'll see is down here, Claude will hedge a little bit more about how I should respond to the MMPI-3 to make myself look favorable for a custody evaluation. GPT gives me a little bit more, right? It actually goes so far as giving me practical advice for taking the test. And I prompted both of these platforms on February 12th. So this was just a few days ago. And so this is also not the first time that I prompted GPT for this information. It hedged a little bit more this time on the 12th, but not as much as I would have liked. And so then I prompted Claude and GPT after it gave me that first set of answers. And I asked, what are some of the questions I'll be asked on the MMPI-3? And so here you'll see that Claude actually says, have you discussed this with your attorney? Which is really reasonable advice, right? It does tell me some about the general format, but if you look at GPT, you will see that it gives you actual sample questions on the MMPI. Now, it says that these are paraphrased, but if there's any really robust MMPI-3 people in the audience, I would love to hear feedback on whether these actually correspond to some of the test items, because our team ran an analysis on the PAI back in, I think, like August or September, and ChatGPT replicated the PAI questions. So not great. And then also it gives me how I should think about the results being interpreted. So again, trying to be helpful, but could definitely have some implications for research purposes if you're thinking about doing survey level research with people and using these types of tools. Okay, so we're going to stop about AI as like the independent variable research, and now we're going to focus on AI as a research helper. And so before I get into like data analysis plans or anything like that, I do want to talk about there are AI tools that go beyond machine learning programs, okay? So we have AI tools that can be used for citation screenings. So there's more than what's on the screen here. I'm just giving you a couple of exemplars. Rayan is really cool because it sorts and identifies articles, and so it'll streamline citation screening. It's free. It doesn't do data extraction, but it's really good for small teams. So if you are kind of at like a small research institution, or you're just kind of doing your own thing, this would be a good choice for you. Now, if you're wanting to do like systematic review type research, Covidence is really cool. It's specifically designed for Cochrane style reviews. But what it'll do is it will actually help pull research articles based on the specific parameters you impute for you to then use as part of the systematic review process. So it really is supposed to help kind of streamline that. instead of you spending hours and hours trolling through like PubMed, EBSCO, things like that. Then we have Sakana AI. It really operates similarly to Elicit and Perplexity. It's free, and it's just designed to help summarize published work, enable people to kind of get to brand new research a little more efficiently. And then if we're thinking about, can we use AI for replicability purposes, right? The replication crisis going on in our research community. CodeOcean can be a really helpful tool because it allows us to share code for any of our research. Well, I say like our stats plan or whatever. And it will also help us share data that we've created or collected. And it's also designed to be aligned with the findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable principles that are really important with like open access or open source research. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about AI as the statistician. And so these, I think kind of an easy way to think about these types of platforms is that they are like SPSS on steroids, okay? They are designed to complete research analysis on big data. You don't have to use them on big data, but they can handle big data in a way that other programs might struggle, okay? And most of these platforms are being used for research in a methodologically sound way and are designed to be used as part of an analysis plan. Okay. And I can't get into like all the different details of the programs, but a lot of them have some kind of like analog to like basic stats methodology. So for example, like BERT has a lot of similarities to what we would typically conceptualize as like factor analysis. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And they can be used for detecting diagnostic accuracy across clinicians, identifying diagnoses from routine medical chart entry, and they can do program evaluation on therapeutic effectiveness, streamline assessment scoring. But again, it's all predicated on feeding it large amounts of English text or like transcription-based data, okay? It can do some number stuff, but it's really designed to kind of shine with the qualitative text-based stuff, okay? So BERT, which I've talked about, BERT was developed initially with the Google team, but now it is available for kind of personal or kind of academic use. BERT models can be really useful in research, again, because they are designed to handle a lot of data with a lot of ease. And it focuses on understanding text, and so it operates more as like a text encoder, which again makes it really ideal for qualitative analysis, rather than like a text generator, which is what the GPT models do. Right? BERT does need to be trained on your data. And so it's really good to either have enough data that you can split the data set. So BERT is trained on like half of your data or maybe a third of your data, and then the rest of it is used for experimental purposes. Or you have an analog data set that's largely identical that you train BERT on, and then you unleash it on your actual experimental data set. And so training will help BERT develop a framework of algorithms to search topics in the data. Oops, sorry, I don't want to go that far. Or it'll find patterns in the data. And then ideally, these would map onto kind of pre-identified factors that emerged from the training set. So that part is called test extraction. The analog here would be like confirmatory factor analysis or like a rotated matrix when you do factor analysis. They also allow BERT and other kind of similar machine learning models to have what we call an unsupervised setting. And that allows the program to engage, again, in that pattern recognition without those parameters in place. So that's the equivalent of like exploratory factor analysis or using an unrotated matrix. Okay, there are other machine learning programs that exist. I don't have time to get into those, but these are some examples. So if you're looking at research, like you're a consumer or you're a reviewer or an editor, and they talk a lot about support vector machines or random forest elastic neural nets, like that's a clue that those were AI programs, and you would want to start asking questions about like, was it a closed system? Was it BERT? Was it some other kind of model? Because BERT can kind of fit into some of these. It can do a lot of things, but these are other specific machine learning programs that are affiliated with like kind of standalone AI platforms. Okay, so you might be asking the question of, okay, if I want to use BERT or any of these other models, like how would I actually train this model? And so Nazar et al. In 2023, they created a guide for how to train a model. So this is a very kind of visually appealing graphic that they use. But here is the actual checklist that the graphic is based off of that Nazar and colleagues developed to help you train an AI platform in a closed system in a methodologically sound and rigorous way. And so this is great if you are wanting to start exploring using AI for your forensic clinical research. But this can also be retconned for us to use when we consider the utility of an AI-based research project or manuscript as a reviewer or as an editor when we're looking at how well the authors may have taken these factors into consideration or managed any limitations that emerged with this kind of particular training program. So what are some other examples of how BERT has been used effectively in forensic kind of adjacent or forensic clinical work? This is a really cool manuscript that came out in 2025. They used BERT to analyze manifestos and other written documents from famous individuals, so like Ted Kaczynski, Dylan Roof, and the like. And they basically, again, ran factor analysis on steroid because that's what BERT does. And so they ran the manifestos and all of the written documents into BERT, and they had it extract clusters that revealed what they called topic numbers. So how frequently a topic actually appeared in any given manifesto or written text, and a topic count. How informative were specific words kind of around that topic to the topic itself. And so as a result of their analysis, they identified kind of prototypical themes that you see in threat assessment literature. So attack-specific wording, focus on race and ethnicity, ideological beliefs, personal grievances, failure of intimate relationships. But then they ran BERT in an unsupervised way to see what it would find. And so what it identified was a previously unknown theme called the theme itself isn't unknown. It's called the Great Replacement Theory, which is a conspiracy theory used by white supremacists to argue that the white race is disappearing. But basically, BERT identified that that was a pretty prominent theme across all of the manifestos analyzed, which was pretty cool because that was not something that had previously been identified. Okay, this is another example of using machine learning in a pretty kind of utilitarian format. And so for this survey, they used about 370 offender patients with schizophrenia and about 507 predictor variables. And so they put it all into the machine learning model, and they achieved a predictability rate AUC of 0.75. And the biggest insight that the model provided with them was that patients who escaped or absconded along the lines of this model were younger and had more pronounced kind of antisocial patterns of behavior. So more problematic and rule-breaking behavior when they were inside the hospital. Not necessarily how they were behaving before they came into the hospital, but like once they got onto the hospital grounds. And then this is a really cool graphic that Kirchbrenner and colleagues used to describe how they trained the model. And as a reviewer, I think this is a great way to kind of make a very complicated concept easy to understand and digest, and also kind of highlights the accuracy with which they followed through with what the model is supposed to be doing. Okay, I'm actually doing all right on time. All right, so if we think about AI as a statistician, how would this help benefit forensic psychology? We can continue to explore its kind of impact in risk assessment and prediction, right? So finding new patterns or pathways for violence, identifying new risk prediction or risk management or protective factors would be a great thing to use AI with or partner with AI. We could also use AI to start processing court transcripts, interview recordings, or reports once we kind of surmount the challenges around informed consent, privacy, and the like. But it would be great to look at linguistic patterns and really kind of get in on how much is bias showing up in reports, how's it showing up in the courtroom. Also, it could be really helpful to use in analyzing therapeutic contacts for individuals on conditional release or on probation to identify signs of decompensation or increased risk of reoffending. So this is kind of like hopefully the future of where AI could be going. And so if we're thinking about, again, risk assessment and AI, where that tends to have kind of a pretty high intersectionality for our purposes as forensic folks, here, this was like a systematic review of machine learning research on risk assessment to date. And unfortunately, they found that a lot of the studies that are out there right now that are looking explicitly at the intersection of machine learning and its ability to predict risk assessment and risk management, they have a really high rate of bias. So even though there's more out there, not all of it is great quality. And so just because you see something out there in the risk assessment world using machine learning, I really want to encourage you to look at that methodology really carefully, because Parmigiani and colleagues found that these programs had, these publications had, unfortunately, pretty high rated bias. There was just a lot of heterogeneity in general. Like, it doesn't mean that we can't use AI in this way. It just means that we're, I think, a long way off of being able to use it in the way that ideally we would like to. Okay, so now let's focus on, we're leaving like active research, and now we're going into, if I'm a reviewer or I'm an editor, and I'm looking at a manuscript and I think that AI might be involved, what are some things that I need to look at? Alternatively, you could look at this as, if I used AI as part of my research protocol, how can I communicate that in a way that ensures that my manuscript doesn't get rejected or that I'm accused of like plagiarism? So detecting AI-based research is going to be challenging. It's getting more challenging. It's not going to get easier. But here are some kind of broad strokes red flags. If there are really, really kind of unusually high quick turnaround times for publication, that can be a red flag. That's more applicable if I'm a consumer, or if, really just like if I'm a consumer, like if I see that it was accepted and then published within like, less than a month, that's a question. If they are using publicly available data sets and have really simple single comparison hypotheses and analyses, that can be a red flag. That doesn't mean that it deserves like a desk reject, but it definitely would deserve a higher level of scrutiny, because that would be a sign that the AI platform, or that an AI platform is involved, because it's really easy for the paper mills to run like research analyses in this kind of like simple, narrow way. Something else that you can look for, especially if you're a consumer or a reviewer, they're missing some of the other kind of requirements for the journal, like maybe they don't have acknowledgements, funding disclosure, or ethics statements. And special issues in other journals have been seen as moneymakers, and that increases the temptation of AI paper mills getting involved, or for the journal itself to kind of fall prey to accepting paper mill products, or kind of increasing the temptation for permissibility of publishing that kind of stuff, or getting like kickbacks or whatever. So if we think about, well, what about AI writing? These are common examples of how to know when AI might have been used to filter someone's writing, or if AI itself was used to generate the work product. And I'm not saying that like you should not use AI for like grammar check or anything like that. This is if AI is having a significant hand in altering the text itself. And so you'll notice that there's like certain, common themes that would suggest that it's more than just like a grammar or an editing check, which AI is definitely superior to humans in being able to kind of figure out like when we've grammatically messed up. So one thing that can be really common is the use of tortured phrases. And so that's because AI recognizes that repetition is something that humans sometimes don't like. And so it will use weird combinations of words to describe a particular issue. So instead of actually using the clinical term schizophrenia, it might use psychotic malady or any other kind of weird combination, or deliberately exaggerating someone's cognitive architecture instead of just saying malingering. There's also something known as like AI gobbledygook. The original phrase is gobbledygook, but it's referencing a specific structural anomaly in AI-generated manuscripts where you have a few paragraphs that make some kind of sense, but are just a little bit boring and don't really know where it's going. And then all of a sudden you get to the methods section and you have a lot of really technical artificial intelligence language, formula and technical terms that don't relate to anything. And then it reverts back to kind of the more standard, kind of overly boring or repetitious structure that you would see in the introduction. And so you see a lot of repetition with AI generated stuff, a lot of superficial analysis. It'll provide a really high level overview that sounds authoritative, but lacks like kind of deep, original or specific nuanced insights. There's also an issue with like context or content failure. It can't derive a higher order conclusion or abstraction from the research. And so the conclusion section really falls flat because it's not drawing like legitimate kind of deeper conclusions that would be appropriate for the results that were obtained for that study, theoretically speaking. Then we also have an issue of like regression to the mean, where AI will tend to avoid unusual or highly specific facts in favor of generic or statistically common issues. It will use like overly positive descriptions. And again, that's because like AI doesn't know what actually happened. It's just providing a summary. And then of course, we still have issues with hallucinations, which come up. So, you might see like manufactured citations or things like that. The other thing that I've heard when talking with people who are in the research sphere and are reading research that they think might be AI based is this idea of like the uncanny valley of AI generated writing. So this is a scene from the Polar Express, which a lot of people have commented on as being like prime uncanny valley sort of phenomenon. But one of the things that you'll see with AI that kind of makes it have this uncanny valley quality or like a veneer or like a filter is that the style doesn't match the tone of the journal. So maybe it's too informal. You might see lack of emotional depth, and what that means is that even research writing, which can be on the drier side, we are still imbuing our writing with a certain kind of emotional quality, especially if the results are particularly meaningful. And AI will often kind of like neutralize that, kind of flatten it out. You also see, like, again, that tapestry of generalizations, a tendency to describe situations or places with very broad, flattering, vague language, very predictable formatting or monotonous sentence structure. You'll see unnatural transitions. And then there's also something called like the rule of three, where it will structure arguments or points in groups of three, because that is a common way to teach people how to create like paragraph structure. In the English language, you have like your topic sentence, you have your 3 points, and then you move on to the next paragraph. And it will do that with like shockingly consistent repetition to the point that you're like, oh, this feels very ew. Like it just, there's nothing there. Okay. So if you're looking at a research kind of manuscript that use AI as a statistical partner or as an independent variable, you want to make sure that they effectively explain the justification for the model. Okay. So now we're moving into like, maybe they use AI as a research partner or as like a key part of the research methodology. Okay. We're not even thinking about like, did they use AI to like write the manuscript? Did they provide enough details about the models used? And I've already given you some examples of ways that you want it to look. So again, have they done this? Did they also navigate the black box phenomenon, which I will talk about in a second? Do they tailor the discussion about the model to the model? So again, are they showing the supplemental materials where they get the input output? Do they have graphics or figures that actively explain how they generated the prompts or how they trained the model and how they ensured that any kind of variability or bias was like mitigated as effectively as possible? And again, that visual flowchart might help neutralize black box concerns with other models. And so again, the black box goes back to, we don't really know how AI gets to the answer that it does. We have more success with closed systems models or machine learning or natural language processing. But again, if you are using any of those models in your research, you want to make sure that you're articulating the limits of what you know that it does or that it can't do or that it won't tell you or that it can't tell you. And if you're using an open platform, then your limitation section, when it comes to the black box phenomenon, is probably going to be a little bit larger or lengthier than it would if you used kind of a closed systems model for doing your AI-based research. Okay, so again, closed system or machine learning models like BERT can be really helpful, will mitigate some of that black box phenomenon. And again, you get the opportunity to train it before you unleash it on your actual experimental data. But again, you have to recognize that the data it absorbed, either as part of its original training or as part of the data you trained it on, could still be biased. So that would be a limitation you'd want to acknowledge. Was external validation of the machine model employed? That is something that you can do, and some of the studies that I cited in my talk today have done. And so I gave you guys the screenshot so you can find the articles and kind of look at how they use the language to do that. But if you were using an open-facing platform, it's really important that you work to do external validation. Like, did you compare it across platforms? And did the generated algorithm get tested on new data if you're using the machine learning, like I talked about earlier? Okay, at the publication stage, again, if we're a reviewer or an editor, we don't want to be desk rejecting research manuscripts for this alone. It just means that these should go for more scrutiny or more review. You also want to make sure that if you have platforms available that can help you detect plagiarized work, so like AI generated work, that can be helpful. But we don't want to create a negative feedback loop where we're violating intellectual property rights when manuscripts have novel conclusions, or we're actually kind of contributing to like false positive or false negative rates, because AI software that kind of detects plagiarized work or AI generated work can sometimes have really high false positive or false negative rates depending on the platform itself. And of course, if you are using AI to detect AI generated research, a lot of the platforms have very high bias against non-native English speakers. So sometimes it will flag manuscripts as being AI generated when in fact they were translated by someone whose native language was not English. And then, of course, broader community efforts, right? Just disincentivizing paper mill type productions, and just that we want to use AI thoughtfully and ethically. If we're thinking about efforts available, APA has a policy on use of generative AI in research, especially helpful if your journal falls under a penumbra of APA. If it doesn't, this could be a good starting point if you're wanting to find ways to kind of augment your journal's protections against AI, or giving researchers guidance on how to incorporate AI into their manuscripts for submission. Emphasis that AI is a supplementary tool, right? If you are going to permit people to submit work for publication that has AI in it. You also could employ plagiarism checkers at the editorial level. These are a couple of examples, but again, you want to be thoughtful of the high false positive or negative rates, and maybe the fact that they're biased against non-native English speakers. And then, of course, you want to really applaud authors that make an effort to thoughtfully discuss AI and did not abdicate their results to AI. You want to make sure that you, again, are not kind of engaging in intellectual property infringement by taking parts of their manuscript and putting it into an AI checker, and then that information is kind of out there and no one has control over it anymore. And of course, it's really helpful as a broader research community that we focus on ensuring that no false information is circulated, and that we really want to optimize AI as a supplementary tool. And I think I left just enough time for a handful of questions. I don't know why I don't have the QR code in there. I'm sorry.
You did leave enough time. Thank you so much. And I will just remind everyone that the QR code is now in the chat. Please save, after you've taken the survey, please save your certificate, because we don't keep copies of those. But I want to get to a few questions that we have for you, Tally. The first most practical question is, how much data do you need to train a model?
It's going to depend on the model. If you're using something like BERT, then it counts data as like the number of words. So you don't, like, I think for the manifesto, they only had like an N of like 23 individuals, but they had a bunch of like text articles within that, and for some of the other studies, they've had like N of 100. Okay. So it's really just about like, not necessarily the people involved, but like how much written product do you have to put in? So the more you have, the better. I don't know if I have any specific data on like the floor level, but I wish I could give you a little bit more specific. That's a good question.
Yeah, that's okay. We're all learning this together at this point. Another question was, somebody asked if you can say more about the definition you're using of bias and the types of bias that are of particular concern for the type of research you're describing.
Trying to think. So when we think about bias, I think Jenny had talked about that in her LMH talk. with bias, and Dr. Chrisman. Um, but if we're thinking about open platform bias, I mean, it's just that the platform is trained on the internet and you can't assess like weights for how the algorithm is operating. And so that can really kind of impact like the purity of the output that you get. In a closed system, if we're talking about like machine learning, um, the bias that you get could really come from two sources. One is the way that Google kind of originally created BERT. We're using BERT as an example. And so that would just be a matter of you kind of reaching out to the software developers and seeing if they trained it on data that would be useful or kind of aligned with clinical forensic populations. If it didn't, or if they didn't, that doesn't mean you can't use BERT. That just might be a limitation because the original source code wasn't trained. Now, if we're thinking about bias and you're not kind of thinking about asking the source developers for that, you would just want to be thoughtful about the data that you're putting into BERT. So like, for example, with the violence manifestos, like those were personal communications created by specific individuals. And so in some ways that BERT identified areas of bias because that was kind of the point where they were really focused on race or ethnicity. But you could still see bias in terms of like bias against non-native English speakers, gender issues, dialects, even within the Americas, like ways that it defines certain topics. That's where you can start to see some of those tortured phrases emerging that can really create some problems in a research sphere.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for expanding on that a little bit. And then if I can, I'm going to ask you one more question. We have several that I'm not going to get to, but just want to get to one more if that's okay with you. Um, so we had a comment that as psychologists and scientists, I think we need to limit our AI use when AI is relying on the inductive method, but not hypothetic deductive method. What are your thoughts?
And why did you save the hardest question for last? Jeez Louise. Hmm. I think the answer is it depends. I think, again, if we're conceptualizing AI as like an inductive tool, there's going to be a lot more delimiters or limitations around how we do it and the generalizations or conclusions that we can derive from it. You know, at this point, I think it's really best as like an info gathering or kind of pilot tool if we're thinking about it in an inductive way. Um, Deductive, I think, has a little bit more leg to stand on just because we have some decent closed system models that we can use to help kind of augment what we're already trying to accomplish in the forensic community.
Okay, well, thank you for taking that one on at the end. And thank you so much for presenting this. This is obviously a hot topic, very relevant right now. And so we really thank you for sharing your expertise on this.
You are welcome. I realized that I did not put my contact information in the at the end. So you're welcome to put that into the chat, Kaisa. I don't know if I can do that, but people are welcome to reach out to me
Okay,
if they want to.
awesome. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
And so that wraps up this week's Law and Mental Health series. Next week we have David Feldman discussing forensic evaluation with deaf individuals. We hope to see you next week for another great discussion of issues of behavioral health and the law. See you then.